So today, um, we're going to dive into the civil rights movement. We're going to do it through the lens of an institution, um, Highlander Folks School. When I took civil rights courses in my undergrad and grad school, you hear about the major players. You hear about the institutions of these major players, the NAACP, the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, NAACP. But I've seemed to have steamrolled over an important institution by the name of Highlander Folks School. Myles Horton was a phenomenal human being. Through my research, I found that he created blueprints and templates for generations, not only in the Depression years, but in the Civil Rights Movement, and some of these same templates we use today. The Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, the media resources that we use through our social media outlets stem from the ideas that the civil rights movement had, and Highlander being intertwined in that movement as well. I think what I like the most about this movement is it was an interracial movement. Everybody has their favorite pieces of history in the civil rights movement, slavery or whatnot, but I tend to develop different theories and ideas and pick apart the civil rights movement and attach on to certain things and kind of build my research from there. So in today's lecture, I'm going to read an excerpt from the book, You Can't Padlock an Idea. In September of 1957, on the occasion of Highlander Folks School's 25th anniversary, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. visited the school both to celebrate its history and to deliver the keynote speech for the festivities. While his speech dealt primarily with race relations and early gains of the civil rights movement, King opened with unequivocal praise for Highlander and its work. For 25 years, you have stood on the dauntless courage and fearless determination, and I quote, "You have given the South some of its most responsible leaders in this great period of transition. And so I am happy to congratulate you today for all your great work and hope for you many more years of creative and meaningful work." During this time, it was kind of like Barack Obama coming to the platform and speaking on your behalf. It was him giving you a shout out in an interview or a media outlet, newspaper, magazine. It was a good time for Myles Horton to receive such a keynote speech from Dr. Martin Luther King. He pretty much gave a stamp to his movement, to his idea that morphed into what it became, the importance of what it became. Myles Horton was born in Tennessee and studied at the Union Theological Seminar under the tutelage of Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr was an American Reformed theologian and commentator on politics and public affairs. He was also a professor at the same seminary school for more than 30 years. More of a mentor to Horton. Horton would later transfer to the University of Chicago, where he studied sociology, and as a transplant in the city of Chicago, found the engine to his movement at a Danish folk dance. Horton began to read a lot about Danish folk schools and decided that he would go to Denmark and kind of study and investigate these schools for himself. So there he would discover a gentleman by the name of Bishop Nikolai Grundtvig, whose educational vision himself morphed into these Danish folk schools that Horton was so interested in, and he was also considered a great Danish poet in the 19th century. The first Danish school was opened in 1851 under the direction of Christian Cole. The purpose of the folk schools in Denmark were devoted into linking education to the needs of local communities. Now, this formative led to the Highlander idea that Horton will soon come to envision for social change back in the United States of America. It will become more of an educational model. Highlander was then founded in 1932 in Grundy County, considered one of the poorest counties in Tennessee. Kind of goes to show you how Horton may have grown up. At its inception, the goal was to prepare rural and industrial leaders for a new social order during the Great Depression. This format will, as I stated earlier, later serve as a template for generations after. Myles Horton and Don West, another person who started the school with Myles Horton, but only lasted a year with the project, but his work was still integral as they both would convince a retired professor, Dr. Lillian Johnson, to use her property to start an adult education center. As a school for laboring classes in the South, Highlander was designed to teach union leaders how to organize and workers how to run these unions and meetings. The unions began taking their stance when the new Section 7A of the National Recovery Act came into effect. This act guaranteed the rights of labor to organize and bargain collectively through chosen representatives. In 1929, after the Wall Street crash, better known as the Great Crash, Highlander was involved in several programs during a time where the country was economically paralyzed. And many people were not talking too much about freedom and democracy, rather conversations about food, clothing, and shelter. They aided strikers of the woodcutters who demanded a pay raise. They assisted in picket lines when picket lines were illegal, putting themselves on the front lines with strikers to highlight discriminations, the living conditions, and industrial exploitations from employees, for employees who worked 60 to 70 hours per day for low wages of $6 to $7 per week. Myles Horton and John Thompson would travel to D.C. to show these living conditions and instances of discrimination by local officials. Though this would be a failed attempt on Myles Horton and Highlander, it still created unity among these working people and supplied a solid base for Highlander as a brotherhood and continued to extend the idea of unionism throughout Grundy County. Highlander was designed to create this awareness, this necessity for adult education, and create a space for the discussions of political systems and teachings of the Bible and comparative histories. But most important, social efficacy that will contribute to daily functions within their communities. These efforts consisted of well-stocked libraries, free music lessons, square dancing, group singing, which was led by Myles Horton's wife, Zephia's Horton. But most of all, it was the traditions of group study and play where people came together to bond. Highlander will also be useful in the national projects during the Great Depression years as they assisted with the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. This program was an employment and infrastructure system created to put 8.5 million people to work through public work projects where they built highways, repaired and paved roads, built schools, planted trees, and constructed over 130 new hospitals, all under Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1935. The idea, nonetheless, was to stimulate the economy, put Americans back to work again. This also led to sponsoring of projects within the arts that employed actors and writers and musicians. However, the African American community did not benefit from these measures, either federal, state, or local. Whether it be the short-lived days of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s or the sharecroppers on the plantations in the South, African Americans were harshly discriminated against and oftentimes, if not most, excluded. Highlander is an important piece of the puzzle to the civil rights movement as the school developed these strategies to tackle poverty and social injustices. These strategies that were used in the 1930s and the pedagogy practices that served during the era of were often used during the civil rights movement as well. Many of the same teachers and organizers were found utilizing some of these same practices from active leaders during the early stages of the school. Through contract negotiations, grievance processes, and labor journalism, this helped people connect their personal experiences to achieve social change. Cultural traditions, specifically labor drama, journalism, literacy education, and folk music were means to help students shape their experiences into effective rhetorical strategies. Group singing was especially a way in which bonding and self-reflection played a huge role. Through music, the feelings of trials and tribulations served as an outlet to many of the social problems people dealt with in their communities. This was an important agency used in fostering the morale when directly resisting violent responses. Looking back during the times of the civil rights movement, in protests and marches, music brought a sense of solidarity to the violent reaction from resistors towards their movements. These images will be captured through the media, whether they be highlighted through newspaper or television. It brought awareness to the nonviolent approach the SCLC and SNCC developed in order to let the world see exactly how bad it was going in the Jim Crow South. From 1932 to 1961, Highlander staff would work with and contribute to the Southern labor movement, the farm labor organization efforts, and the civil rights movement. During the 1950s, Highlander became more involved with race relations and the throes of the Southern horrors that haunted African Americans in the Jim Crow South. They moved from the labor union methods of action and began to focus more on the race-pressing issues during this time. The world was changing. The world was changing for Black folks. Education and civil rights were imperative. Labor has always embodied African Americans as sharecroppers and maids in agriculture, but during this time, education was power. Voting was power. All of these things started to intertwine, and black folks wanted more. Horton's philosophy of cooperation and less competition would align with these civil rights movement to a certain degree, but the civil rights movement was fighting to compete. They wanted to be relevant, sharing the same freedoms as white people, and Horton believed that his freedom didn't matter if everybody didn't have it. His freedom wasn't important if everybody couldn't share in it. Highlander was built for movements such as these and in tandem embarked on great measures to assist well-known names in the history books we know of today. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, James Bevel, the one and only Septima Clark, John Lewis, and Ella Baker, just to name a few. Highlander helps students to rhetorically frame social problems. This was a model from Horton's Highlander's ideas, that rhetorical education was necessary to serve as a foundation to direct action and social change. Rhetorical education, which is important, because this is the thesis of Highlander. It could be defined broadly as all life experiences in and out of school that contribute to communication competency, successful and efficient communication, confidence. What was unique about Highlander was the fact that it was already a desegregated school. It was a school of people living and working together during a time where desegregation was illegal. So imagine crossing the color lines in a multicultural way where all these races are intermixing with each other, the same things that most Southerners and most people felt that was a threat to the population of white citizens. Dating outside the racial lines, misogyny. These things played a role, but they were already doing it. They already made up their mind. It wasn't outside agitators or communists from Moscow coming in and whispering in the ears of these people. These were things that were developed in their own right mind to say, we're going to work together to create social change, this rainbow coalition, right? Septima Clark, along with Myles Horton and others, believed in developing local leaders. That's why this was so important, local leaders. Local leaders were used to organize events such as protests, voter registration drives, sit-ins, and nonviolent direct actions as a whole. They were trained to basically take matters in their communities in their own hands while operating under the philosophy that oppressed people knew the answers to their own problems. We know what we want. We know what we need. It's not a fluke. We're here today and we're standing up for what we believe in. And we're no longer quiet. We're no longer afraid. So citizenship schools were developed by Highlander to help promote people how to learn and how to read and write so they could pass these literacy tests in order to vote. These initiatives changed the broader scope of blacks as they gained more confidence to stand up against the white power structures in their communities. So they're huddling up in one space, but then they're dispersing with confidence, new attitudes, a broader scope on life. Septima Clark was a teacher at the black school in Johns Island, so she had already learned the values of teaching in local communities. Clark was invited to lead workshops at Highlander. These integrated workshops' goals were to develop these local leaders, and most importantly for Septima Clark, women's development. So Myles Horton, a man looked upon as a hillbilly radical and intellectual radical, believed that the American school system only educated you on how other people lived and not how you should live, how you should help yourself. So when we come back, we will continue on Myles Horton and the American school systems. Right now, we're just going to take a 5-minute break. If you have to use the restroom, come back and we'll pick up momentarily. All right, so welcome back. We're going to pick up where we left off when we discussed Myles Horton as a radical hillbilly and radical intellectual. He believed that the American school system only educated you on how other people lived and not how you were supposed to live or how you were to help yourself. For those who are just joining us, we're talking about the Highlander Folks School, a school that was founded in 1932 in efforts for adult education to help people deal rhetorically with the issues that were going on in their communities. A lot of people labeled Myles Horton as a communist supporter, and the opposition and the government agencies felt that he was working with outside agitators pushing this communist agenda. It's always somebody else coming in and ruining something, right? It can never be just you having an idea that I want to better myself. I don't like what's happening with me. I don't like what's happening in my community. Things need to change. This is how we're going to do it. Satisfaction is not real always. People want better. People want to make changes in their lives. People want to fight for what they feel like they deserve. And Myles Horton, he knew that. So nonetheless, Horton felt as though the school system was designed to keep intact the nuts and the bolts in a society of capitalistic ideals, only to maintain the institution and its status quo. Go to school, graduate, get a job, buy a house, have some kids, live the American dream. I mean, even today, that theory still stands, right? But are we living the American dream? Is everybody living the American dream? I mean, even when you talk about segregation and desegregation, have we, in today's time, reverted back to Plessy versus Ferguson? Some may say that the suburbs are segregated in respect to both housing and education, right? It is possible that we've reverted back to separate but profoundly unequal, as we fund schools based on property taxes, in which more money is spent on the affluent children and least money is spent on the poor neighborhoods in their school districts. So Horton believed that if poor folks learned about their own lives, maybe they can learn how to make their lives better. Kind of rings true today. Highlander wasn't just learning or introducing political strategies, right? Or learn about economics. He encouraged self-awareness through culture, through art, poetry and music. Music became a staple within Highlander, and it was the key part to educational aids that taught adults how to effectually deal with their common problems. Earlier stated, Horton's wife, Sophia, was considered a musical genius. She would later be credited with the re-engineering of the song "We Will Overcome" to "We Shall Overcome." There's significance in that song. We still sing it today, but there's significance in that song, and we'll get to that a little bit later. The Civil Rights Movement was a period in which people from various backgrounds came together due to these invidious attacks on the untenable rights that swung in the face of African American people. These rights were never promised from the inception of European capture, slavery, or post-emancipation. Hundreds of years later, birthright citizenship will continue to remain a dream, and degradation to African Americans will continue. But this interracial rainbow coalition through Highlander, whether it be by happenstance or a moral responsibility, nonetheless had a template in place that will help aid in African Americans' quest for truth, freedom, and democracy, much more like an intimate link that allowed the staff of Highlander to articulate their own educational activism with local struggles and for democratic change. When we talk about the Civil Rights Movement, we speak on Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and all the institutions such as the NAACP, the SCLC, SNCC. These movements that help shape the nonviolent direct action projects, movements. This movement, this formative, led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, an act that outlawed discrimination based on race, religion, color, sex, national origin, and in today's time, sexual orientation and gender equality. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 also derived from the movement that aimed to overcome legal barriers at state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising their rights to vote. As guaranteed under the 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, on March 7, 1965, 600 people gathered in Selma, Alabama for a march. Governor George Wallace was steadfast in refusing to let happen. Okay, but Wallace ordered state troopers to intervene, led by Hosea Williams and John Lewis. These marchers were beat with nightsticks, tear gassed, and pushed down, while others, both men and women, were brutally beaten or passed out. Federal protection was ordered, and the lifting of the court order to march was successful, with over 25,000 marchers from all over the nation successfully organized and finally crossed Selma's Bridge. White civil rights activist Viola Luzio was unfortunately murdered driving marchers back to Selma on March 25th. Lyndon B. Johnson, and I quote, "The words of the movement, their cause, must be ours too. Because it is not just the Negroes, but really it is all of us who must overcome this crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. We shall overcome," end quote. It just takes me back to the initial goal of Highlander, right? Music. Here you have a president of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, giving his address nationally across the world. And that's why I said that this was so significant, because it pretty much put a dagger in the heart of all segregationists, right? It pretty much said the Iron Curtain has closed and your temple is tearing down. And I say that in a cynical fashion because while we hoped and thought that that would be the case, we would still see some of these same atrocities today in different forms. But nonetheless, it was a victory. Nonetheless, it was a victory for MLK, it was a victory for Myles Horton, all the major players in this movement during this time. You can not mention the civil rights movement without talking about the institutions such as Highlander Folks School and Myles Horton, an idea that sparked several movements over a period of 30 years. And that is not to say that Highlander was never mentioned, but from personal experiences, it had been steamrolled over in my civil rights discussions. We spoke on them in my undergrad, but it would be my grad school years that I actually really started paying attention to Highlander and what it meant to African Americans. But you also have to take into consideration and talk about the courageous women, such as Ella Baker, Septima Clark, Bernice Robinson, Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks. For these women played a significant role, if not a bigger role than that of the popular, well-spoken ministers whom past historians give all the praise. In 1955, December 1st, 4 months after the death of Emmett Till, Mrs. Parks was tired from a long day's work and took an aisle seat by the window. We've all heard this story. During this time, segregation in public facilities was the law and strongly upheld by white Southerners. A police officer by the name of J.F. Blake would ask Parks for a seat when a white man was forced to stand because of overcrowding. However, on this day, Mrs. Parks didn't budge. And I quote, "I was thinking the only way I could let him know how I was being mistreated was to do what I did, resist the order." She would later be arrested and taken into custody. Rosa Parks grew up with a hard life with her father tricked out of his land by a white man. She did not receive much education, and like most blacks, she was not able to vote. But what people don't know about Rosa Parks was just 6 months earlier, she attended the Highlander Folks School, where they were trained to effectually deal with the atrocities in which they faced during the years of segregation. She attended a 2-week program with Virginia Durr, a woman she worked for as a seamstress and an ally in the movement for the segregation efforts. However, Parks remained skeptical of desegregation efforts in Montgomery and did not believe that African Americans would rally around the issue. During this time, many white Southerners couldn't wrap their minds around the decision handed down from the Supreme Court ruling that the U.S. state laws establishing racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional, even if segregated schools are otherwise equal. This moment in history would be a gift and a curse to the black community because on one hand, it was the reaffirmation of desegregation efforts by activists and their allies, and on the other, it was the fear of white Southerners and the weak laws of the land that allowed for a stream of violence and lynchings amongst African Americans. There was fear of equality, there was fear of competition, there was fear of white class depopulation. Nonetheless, it was the catalyst to the death of Emmett Till. The story of Emmett Till begins with the childhood of a boy growing up in Chicago. Emmett's trail back home to their native soil in Mississippi will be the last time Emmett Till will see her son alive. Chicago and Mississippi had this intertwined relationship because most people from Chicago were from Mississippi. And you know how it is. Oftentimes you go home and you visit for the summers and you play with your cousins and you get to know them more and you do something completely different. With the efforts of coming back a little bit more mature, probably get some work done down there in the South, probably work harder than you do in Chicago, right? Kind of grow you up a little bit, become a man. But Emmett Till's return to Chicago would be in a pine box, dead from a gunshot wound to the head, an eye gouged out and his nose chopped off. And I described it like that purposely, explicitly on purpose, because this would be the reason why his mother, Mamie Till, would opt to have his funeral with an open casket for all the media to see. This funeral, publicly televised, rallied people together from all over the country to pay close attention to what was going on in the South, thus driving what we know today as the Civil Rights Movement. Media resources, media outlets. I cannot credit that to Highlander, however, I can. Mamie Till did something completely different that day when she made the decision to have an open casket funeral. She too created a blueprint for generations of today. But going back to the story of Rosa Parks as it relates to Highlander, was that she mounted her own personal challenges, the goals of the school, with police brutality to challenge segregation, more of a personal appeal. She knew she had to do this. She knew she had to develop a personal appeal to really get back home to Montgomery, Alabama and shake some things up, make some noise. At Highlander, these practices were developed in what they call halfway house movements. It provided the tools and resources to develop leaders and taught them how to organize events. The Southern Leadership Conference, in which was envisioned by Dr. Martin Luther King, Ella Baker, and Bayard Rustin, just to name a few, organized after the success of the Montgomery bus boycott efforts to continue nonviolent action strategies to desegregate the bus systems across the entire South. It wasn't by happenstance that these media contacts were available to students to participate in Highlander Folks School. These media outlets were important. The resources and the contacts were important. It was imperative in order to gain wider support and a wider audience, as it did. People from all over the world would see these atrocities taking place during the March on Selma, from Jim Clark or his deputies and the violence on the Selma March across the bridge, or good old Bull O'Connor in Montgomery, Alabama. Many of these viewers will become adversaries in monetary fashions and in physical support as many travel to partake in these marches and protests throughout the South. When you talk about the civil rights movement today, you talk about everything that we've probably seen in the media over the past 15, 20 years, from the Rodney King beating that was televised and the injustices that happened from that. You talk about the strategies that the blueprint has handed, that Highlander has handed down, and the blueprint that it has handed down for such movements today, such as the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement, or the Supreme Court victory that says gay marriage is legal. We talk about COVID-19 and how Black folks were always being murdered, and these things were not necessarily televised, or people didn't care, or you'll see Trayvon Martin being shot down, or you'll not see, but you'll hear, or you'll hear about Fred Gray in Baltimore, or Eric Garner, or Sandra Bland. And all these distractions that kept us from really paying attention. But these marches and these protests when Michael Brown got shot were the footsteps of Emmett Till. Highlander showed us how to draw personal connections to our problems to create social action. But the world sat still for a period in time in 2020 when George Floyd was killed by a police officer. During COVID-19, everybody was in the same space at the same time, quiet and still. And this will be the moment that this blueprint will come to life, because the interracial movement came together once again. The Rainbow Coalition came together once again, because we all cared at the same time. We will pick back up next week with the Montgomery bus boycott and its victories, and we will talk more about Highlander as we transition over into the NAACP and the factions that began to split up with SCLC and Ella Baker, and what led to SNCC. So I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture today, and we will pick back up next week. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.